welcome to the TDS Talking Early Years podcast. Now, each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe who offer exclusive insights, some inspiration, and a lot of guidance that helps practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Welcome to the TDS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and my guest, Ben Kingston-Hughes. And we're talking about all things play in these episodes. And today we're going to talk about the role that humour plays in play. And any of you who work with children in the early years will know that humour, and especially early years humour, is a massive part of every day. So for you, Ben, particularly in terms of play, where do you see that relationship between humour and play?
I think, well, firstly, I think humour is very undervalued. We use humour as an adult, I say more than we do maths, more than we do, grammar. It's a vital human social function. It's unique. And I think the fact that it seems to be marginalised and we don't focus on it. I mean, it's not mentioned in the EYFS, for instance. It's not mentioned in, national curriculum. It's one of those things. It's a vital social function. And I think play is just how children express their whole worldview. So, of course, humour in play, for us, is particularly powerful, especially as we work with genuinely vulnerable children who've had pretty much everything taken away from them. You get that child to laugh. It's one of the most beautiful things you'll ever see. So we love humour and we fully accept that early years humour in particular can be slightly basic. And we're not going to, it's about poo, isn't it? And I think there are adults who will try and crush that. I think we need to be on board with that because you're not going to get biting political satire from a 4-year-old, are you? What you actually want is poo, wee-wees, bogies, because it's funny.
It is. And if you've had children of your own, you will know that. If not, if you work in early years, you know that because they are very obsessed. And death, it's all the things that the polite society doesn't want us to talk about. But that is very much how they are functioning. And you're right, there are... Yeah, I remember writing some time ago now a blog for the Childcare Expo, which is about a real situation that happened when I was a teacher where we had wall-mounted urinals and the children who were 4 had never seen a wall-mounted urinal before. In fact, probably never even seen a urinal before. And I got a call because 2 boys had sat in the urinal to do a poo. And so then, worse than that for them, the flush came on and completely soaked them down the back. But this whole scenario was around the fact that, they were just happily sitting there next to each other, having this very kind of collegiate poo, but yet there was poo in the urinal. So, but it's part of the job that we do, especially in early years. And I wrote that blog, but there was a letter of complaint that came in from another early years expert that basically said to the Childcare Expo, we really shouldn't be, as a profession, talking about the fact that, there is humour in scatorial content. But actually, that is what a lot of our job in early years, not all of it, but a lot of it is about that. And certainly that is what children find hilariously funny.
Yeah. I think if you have that view that, that poo is something to not be laughed at, I think you're probably listening to the wrong podcast with it. But, I don't know if you know the book, very famous book, The Dinosaur That Pooped a Planet.
Yeah.
A great book, but there's a page where the word poo is like huge letters across the page. And if you're reading that to 30 children and you get them all shouting that word poo, it's a moment of pure joy. And I don't think anyone could look at that and go, oh, no, that's not appropriate. But somebody's left a review on Amazon for that book that says, 1 star, do not buy this book. It is about poo.
Well,
I mean, how they didn't get that from the title, I don't know.
Exactly. I mean, the little mole that knew it was none of his business, where that pooing on people's heads. Again, I've had practitioners say we don't read that one because we don't want to encourage that. Aliens wear underpants, anything to do with, knickers, pants, all that kind of thing. And obviously, when you are discussing that as a team, which I think is really important that you do have those times where you sit around a table and talk about the kind of culture of your space, because again, we don't do that very much. How does humour play a role? There are obviously, maybe safeguarding issues that could arise when you're starting to talk about things that involve children's toilet habits. Yeah. But again, all of those things are not insurmountable. They just need a bit of pre-discussion.
And I also think that we have to accept that with any developmental process, there's going to be stages. So actually the poo and the toilet humor is just one more stage in a vital social process, and we don't all grow out of it. When I tell, I make funny stories about some stuff that children have done, and there are people on my training course, so I'm sure you get this as well. You tell a poo story and you've got people crying with laughter.
Yeah.
So it's not a bad thing. If adults find it funny, and we've already gone through those stages, then I think, we do need, and it's interesting you say that we don't sit around and have that discussion. I think when we're doing any kind of planning, it's very rare that a setting or a school would plan for humour, would plan something specifically because it's funny. And I think that's something that it'd be really nice if we could start to do, is like, say, what can we do that's going to make our children laugh? Because again, the research on laughter and humour now, and I researched this for my new book, is I had no idea myself. And I've always used comedy and humour for my, working with children and like yourself for our training. But I didn't know just how beneficial it was in terms of the biochemistry, in terms of the wellbeing stuff, but also in terms of creative thinking, problem solving, imagination, because it requires a lot of imagination to come up with a funny thing to say. And yet that's the stuff that we tend to crush in our children because it's seen as cheeky or inappropriate, when actually they're the people who could change the world one day.
Exactly.
So it's a plan for laughs, definitely.
And when you laugh, it makes you feel good. And when you feel good, your well-being goes up, your body chemistry changes. Just the idea that humor and feeling good, obviously in a learning space or in a personal or social interaction, can only be beneficial.
Yes.
So I don't think we're talking about the fact that we want to kind of reenact like Benny Hill with everybody running around to music and patting each other on the head, that kind of, it's the idea that you can have we talked about in episode 1, but a playful approach to your learning space, or a humorous approach where humor is important.
Well, you can break down humour and what makes people laugh. And yes, of course, we've talked about the laboratorial stuff, the human bodily functions. And to children, that is funny. But there's also incongruity when something is not quite what you expected. And it's right from babies, when you do peekaboo, if the face you pull is slightly different, we now know from research that the baby will respond more. And actually their first laughs probably come from that wonderful attunement play with the carer. So it's that novelty. And again, back to the biochemistry, we now know that dopamine production, which is a wonderful feel-good hormone, but we now know that dopamine production, which makes you feel amazing, is ramped up massively if the happiness is surprising or unexpected. And that means that the joke that's got the punchline you weren't expecting, or the funny action, or the teacher doing something that the children weren't expecting, it doesn't just make everybody feel better, just on a conscious level. It floods you with way more dopamine because it's that novel experience. Which
is why someone does a massive trump on the carpet, everybody laughs hysterically, because not only is it funny, but it's unexpected, humour. Ideally, not the adult, but hey,
So I do some Kinderly webinars, so massive groups of people. And the week before, I did a Kinderly webinar on humour and laughter. So my wife has bought me some sugar-free chocolate. And what I didn't know about sugar-free chocolate is one of the sugar substitutes called malitol. One of the side effects is extreme wind. And so that evening I've got to do a webinar for parents. So I've got 40 parents. I'm doing parent play training, and I've had loads of this chocolate because it's delicious. It's chocolate, it's just like a famous brand. So I necked 3 of these bars of chocolate, and then I'm sat there in front of the screen, and then proper cramping stomach pains start to come on. But I've got a microphone in front of me. I can't. There's no way. So I'm in a shed in the garden, but I'm holding it in, and I'm in absolute agony after the first hour. Luckily, the break comes. So I muted my microphone, and I just let it rip. And people 3 doors down would have heard it.
Did the roof lift slightly?
It was the length of time it took. I looked up at my screen, and I thought, why is my screen black? It's because I turned the camera off. I didn't have the microphone. So in the middle of this parent play training, I have just, all they saw was the screen was black, and this noise would have just rippled. And it went on for like 30 seconds of this.
Excellent.
Noise. So
and all counts, excellent, impressive and excellent.
That happened the week before. I did a webinar about humour. I thought, you know what, I'm going to I'm going to tell that story just to see,
Yeah.
and the amount of people who were laughing at that shows that I know it's basic, and I know bodily functions might not be your cup of tea, but a significant number even of adults found that story hilarious. So we've got to stop being so judgmental on children, haven't we? We've got to support them through the stages, and if they come out the other end and don't find farts funny, fair play to them. If, like you and I, we find that hilarious, again, there's nothing wrong with that.
No, and I think that's exactly it. It's about supporting children through stages and understanding that is a perfectly appropriate and normal stage of their development. Like when they tell jokes that just aren't funny but kill themselves laughing. Yeah. The jokes that make no sense. The punchline doesn't even match the setup, but it's it's the telling of the joke that's funny.
Yeah. And again, it's that incongruity. My son, when he was so young, tiny little baby, would laugh when he put a potato on the cat's head. It's hilarious to him. And it's that little bit of, I wasn't expecting that. For some reason, it makes humans laugh. And it's a lovely moment. I think we do undervalue it because it's life-changing. And like I say, when you see children like I work with who, in fact, this is probably quite a sad thing to say, but one of our groups of children, 4-year-olds, had such extreme abuse that all adults were a source of fear to them. So we walked in to work with these children, they were absolutely terrified of us. So we did some superhero play, and that's bringing it full circle with the imaginative play. But the best thing of all is we got all the adults to dress up as superheroes as well. So we got the foster carers, the social workers, we got the clinical psychologist kind of suit. And it was only when the last adult had got a mask and cape on that the children started smiling. But there was one little boy just stopped in his tracks and burst out laughing. And it's one of the most beautiful laughs you've ever heard in your life. But then he started choking quite violently. Now, please don't panic. He's fine. We gave him a drink of water. He carried on playing. But it was only at the end, his social worker came up to me after the children had gone home and just said, I think that's probably the first time he's ever laughed. And it's you forget how we take it for granted as something that's so natural about the human condition. But a child that's been through such extreme abuse won't have had those opportunities. So for us, laughter's and humour is life-changing. It's unique.
And if you are working with children on a daily basis, why wouldn't you want to do things that make them and you happy? Because also laughter is contagious. Yeah. And we know that with children, but also we know with adults that when you have that, and then it lifts the mood of the room. And that, as you talked about earlier, that changes the dynamic. So you begin to become open to other possibilities. You begin to think in different ways because the mood is all lifted. Yeah. And I also think it links back into what we talked about in the last episode and the one before, about the idea that when you've got a more ambiguous learning space, so one that's a little more unkempt around the edges, so objects that are open to interpretation, loose parts that people are able to transport and move around, a space that doesn't always look like it has to be something, allows for humour to emerge, but a space where you're moving from prescripted activity to prescripted activity, there's very little space then. Humour can still arise, but it's more difficult for it to appear.
Yeah. I mean, we've all had this as trainers. You work in some environments where you're training a group of adults, and there's something about the space where it just lends itself to people feeling safe, comfortable, and that means there's loads of laughs. I did 2 back-to-back conferences a few weeks ago, and the first conference, it was in a school. They'd hired the school because they've got a massive hall, but of course, because it was a weekend, no heating. So it's freezing. People are stood there and they were absolutely freezing. And the manager it was one of the big chains of nurseries, got up and told a joke to warm everyone up. And it was such an awful joke that not a single person out of 130 people, not one person laughed. It was absolutely silence. And then went, now over to Ben. To get a laugh out of that group was so difficult. And the same afternoon, I was in another group of settings where they'd got a hotel for the night. So their annual team day, they were already drinking. It was the atmosphere. I went in, and even the things that aren't normally funny, they were funny, crying with laughter. So it's very subjective, is humor. It is. Right, the environment massively impacts. I'm sure you've had that yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you know that as an educator, and again, we're not talking about educators rocking up and just doing a string of gags at the beginning of every carpet session. No. It's that idea that it's playful and humour is important within space. We also know, even if we're talking about things like phonic development, children's understanding of English language, when a child can appreciate that something is funny because of the way that the language is positioned, that shows a real change in their understanding of language and articulation of language, which will make them a better reader, writer, talker. But humour plays a massive role in how children understand the construct of language, and they enjoy playing around with language when it's humorous, less so if you're sitting on the carpet doing like a thing on a string or 45 minutes of phonics.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it's not, I mean, it sounds quite obvious, but if you're enjoying something, you want to do it more. And
Yeah.
the cornerstone of joyful approaches to education is that if you are enjoying something, that even the process itself becomes linked in your brain to the feelings of enjoyment. It's that whole neurons that excite together, wire together. And after that's repeated that positive experience, you hardwire it. That means you're automatically wanting more of that because your brain has now been hardwired to associate positive feelings with a particular learning style. So, learning subject. So if your learning is playful, if it's joyful, if it's full of humor, over time you crave that learning, and that's a brilliant state for any child to be in educationally, isn't it?
And I think, from my respect as an educator, I think people sometimes worry as well, though, if you have more of a playful approach to teaching and learning, that invites poor or inappropriate or silly behaviour. And again, we could talk about those terms forever, but you don't find it that way, or I don't find it that way. I think children respond way, way better to the whole space, and especially the adults in the space, because they are comfortable and open and happy. Whereas if it's always about compliance or being told that you're not doing something properly or you've got to do something in a particular way, and it all feels like very much like you're being judged as opposed to being accepted, then you get a very different take on how they behave within the space.
I also think there's a myth about what good behaviour actually looks like.
Yeah.
So when in my children's sessions, I'll be the first to admit that they can be very chaotic. They can be they're very noisy, and that's how I want it to be, because that's when I see children that wouldn't necessarily thrive in a more formal environment. That's when I see them becoming alive. But to an outside observer, I think maybe perhaps that looks like I've I suppose I lost control in it. When actually, yes, it might take me slightly longer to get them from one state of play to another because I've used a transitional game where the fun keeps going. It's you've not broken it up by making the children suddenly feel like they're in an adult space. It's for them, and I think that's the key. And humour is a massive part of that. If you can get children laughing, their behaviour will improve because they're automatically feeling better about themselves. And on the surface, it might look chaotic because you're doing a big story about poo and loads of children shouting poo and cheering, but beneath all that, you've got children behaving pro-socially as human beings do behave by sharing humour and laughter together.
And making really positive links to you, the environment, each other, this thing that is called nursery or school or preschool, being a learner. There's so many positives. And I think it's that ultimately, happier adult, happier children, happier adult. Yeah. And although life is full of complications that mean we can't be happy all the time, but if we appreciate the role that humour plays in making learning environments more successful, and even just the biology that humour has a role in terms of children's ability to learn, why wouldn't we want to have a more humorous
space? Why wouldn't we plan for humour when we're actually working out what we're going to do? And actually, as children get older, it's a tool for dealing with grief, bereavement. We use humour as a way to cope with the world. My wife and I went to her father died recently. We went to the funeral and the M1 was blocked. So we were virtually late for our own dad's funeral. So we ran in stressed up to the eyeballs. I mean, really genuinely stressed. But then the first hymn came on and it was Morning Has Broken. And both my wife and I did the old school mistake, whereas we went in too high. And as the song got higher and higher, we're starting to really struggle. Neither of us can sing as well, but you can't hide it because it's a very small funeral. The guy
you can't stop.
3/4 way through, we were screeching like traumatized mice, and we accidentally made eye contact at that moment. We burst out laughing, and I went, "No, that's not the ideal situation. Is laughing, at a funeral, but it helped. It massively helped. The incredible stress that we were under." Just the shared moment of laughter because we couldn't hit the notes.
And it's that immediate stress release. And again, you find humour in the darkest of places. We know that, black humour and black comedy has been a tradition, forever, because, those dark spaces do bring elements of humour. And I think it's important, as we start the whole episode of this, that we just have to recognize those and value them because they bring so much positivity with them.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's a great space to end our third episode. Thanks again, Ben, for some really interesting insights and a hilarious story about wind retention, which may or well not make the final cut.
We'll see about that one. Yeah.
So please join Ben and I in our fourth episode, where we're going to be talking about how we can use play to support more vulnerable children and what that might look like. But for now, thanks again, Ben. It's been great.
Pleasure.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guest today, Ben, for joining us and providing such valuable insights into play. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and Ben Kingston-Hughes. And if you've been inspired by our conversation today, then don't forget, you can sign up via the link in our episode notes and be the first to hear about future episodes, and also access exclusive follow-up content, which will include ideas for your settings and lots of links to relevant resources.